Thanks for joining me on episode 972 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
I'm Robert Farrington from thecollegeinvestor.com. I encourage you to be inspired to become a better steward through financial wisdom by listening to this show, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend Scott Mader.
I talk to people all the time who, when they talk about the voices that they hear, the calling that they hear, they talk about negativity. But the truth is, that isn't what I'm talking about when I talk about hearing the voice of God and hearing your calling. That fear that you have inside of you, that feeling of the imposter syndrome, that belief that you can't do it. Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world. In today's Spiritual Foundation episode about impacting the world, I talk with you about how it is that God put greatness inside you. I also share why recognizing that this is true for you, but also true for everyone else as well, is so important. And I talk about why you really need to recognize this for you and for everyone else. On yesterday's episode, one of the things that Roy said was about how he really believes that God puts greatness inside of us. And I really do believe that is true. In looking at the Bible and looking at the words of God and how I've read them, I believe that God puts a great calling in front of all of us. And he puts the greatness inside of us that we can use to accomplish that calling as well. He equips us with what we need. But we often fight against that. We often don't believe that we have greatness inside of us. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about being arrogant here. I'm not talking about being somebody who stands up and talks about how great they are. I'm not talking about the sort of flash and dash that you see online nowadays. I'm talking about true greatness inside of each of us. And the truth is that when you recognize that, there is a bit of God inside of each of us, and even more importantly, that is true of all of us. Even that person that you look at that maybe gets on your nerves, even that person that you wonder why they were put on earth, even inside of them is that moment of God and that moment of all of us have that. That's what keeps it from being arrogance. That's what keeps that humility inside of us, recognizing that whenever we look into the eyes of another person, we are looking into the eyes of someone blessed by God. When we begin to recognize that, it becomes a moment of real connection. It's true for all of us, the greatest and the least. And yet all too often we look at people based only on the things that we can see in terms of worldly success, the external factors that we can see around us. We don't look at the things that are inside. We don't look at the calling underneath it. We often think that we see people's success because we see external success, and we don't see the challenges and the hardships behind that. We really don't see the path that other people walk. We see our own sometimes, but even there, we don't see it clearly. We don't see into our own walk clearly. That's one of those reasons that it's important to surround ourselves with other people on our walk. It's important to connect for ourselves to others. It's important to call out the greatness of others when you see it. It's important to lift each other up. And yet, all too often, it seems like we spend all of our time tearing each other down and even more tearing ourselves down. I talk to people all the time who, when they talk about the voices that they hear, the calling that they hear, they talk about negativity. But the truth is, that isn't what I'm talking about when I talk about hearing the voice of God and hearing your calling. That fear that you have inside of you, that feeling of the imposter syndrome, that belief that you can't do it or can't make it, those things aren't actually the real calling. Those aren't the real connection to God inside of you. And you have to recognize too that everyone around you is feeling that same doubt, feeling that same fear. Even if it doesn't seem like they are, they probably are. Because the truth is, we all have those fears and doubts inside of us that drowned out that greatness at times. That's part of what Roy and I were talking about yesterday, the ability to have others lift you up and to walk with confidence, not because you think you've got it all figured out, but because you don't, but you're leaning on your relationship with others and your relationship with God to give you the confidence to walk forward. And when we do that, then we're recognizing the greatness that God has put into each and every one of us. Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor. Go over to facebook.com/inspired stewardship and like our Facebook page and mark it that you'd like to get notifications from us so that we can connect with you on Facebook and make sure that we're serving you to the best of our abilities with time and tips there. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.